Howdy and hello. We are back with Cibolo Creek Conversations. My name is Wyatt Marchant, and I'm here with Mr. Paul Wilson. How are you, sir?
Good. How you doing?
Doing all right. Surviving.
I saw a post the other day. You're like 100 days away from getting married.
Yeah, it's like 173, I think.
Oh, wow.
I'm doing my math right?
173. That's more than 100.
Yeah, because it's about six months, which is 180. So, but still, 173 ain't that much.
And from what I understand, you're like almost all prepared, ready to go.
Yeah, just about. Like, we're not even really. The big thing now is just trying to find a place to live without breaking the bank.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Rent high instead of buy high. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, I think that's the going advice.
Yeah. So that's the plan. That's the plan without living in some small apartment that we're on top of each other.
Well, I'm excited for you.
Yeah. No, we're very excited. Looking forward to it. It's very much a blessing.
Good.
And we're glad for you to be doing the ceremony as well.
Yeah, I'm excited and honored to get to be a part of the big day for you guys.
Mm-hmm. I expect you to roast me at some point in your little...
Oh, now why would you think that I would do something like that?
Because you have a platform that I can't respond on. That's why you'd do it.
No, I wouldn't do that on your special day.
You can. You can. If I wouldn't be right unless you did.
Yeah, that's probably the truth. Something would be off if I didn't.
Yeah, something would have to happen, especially with how much of a hard time I give you.
Yeah, the one time we give you a microphone with me and you on the same stage, you didn't miss the opportunity to roast me, like right in front of the entire congregation.
That's how you get everybody to like you instantly. You roast the guy who's always talking.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
But I mean, you give me a microphone, I do something wrong anyways. Honestly, this is the best time I've done because the time before I roasted you on stage when I had the microphone, I went up there and I forgot to turn it on, and then it was very awkward. Just say that.
You trying to get your microphone turned on while you were...
No.
Were you hosting?
Yeah, I was hosting. I just gave up, and I said, all right, guess I'm just going to do it without. But nobody can hear me online, which I didn't think about when I was freaking out on stage.
Oh, yeah.
I kept my cool. But then Matt came and gave me the worship pastor came and gave me his mic, and it didn't work instantly because they had to turn it on. And so I was like, am I being punked? Because I didn't know it was off.
Well, we're just giving you some good, on-the-job training of how to be adaptable in a situation when things aren't going well.
Yeah. I've noticed that as long as you're funny when it happens, there's a lot of forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
Because in the next service, I got it right, and it was boring. I was like, I should have had something go wrong then, too.
You should have just pretended it was wrong.
Yeah. Indeed. But anyways, back to the topic at hand, which I'm about to announce. As you guys know, the past few episodes, we have been doing, answers to some questions that we received on a Q&A Sunday, which is something that Cibolo Creek does once a year, at least, where the congregation just gets to send in any questions they want, and Paul answers them in real time on stage, obviously, with only about an hour, depending on how much Paul wants to push it. He doesn't have that much time to answer that many questions. And so we thought that it would be appropriate to go and answer some of the questions that we received that he didn't get to on that morning. One of which, not one of which, we received a lot revolving around parents sending in, just advice of how to bring their kids up in a culture that is, to say the least, different, perhaps dangerous, whether it's technology or just the culture itself, and very much confusing for how parents should kind of navigate that world. Would you say that's pretty good?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just sitting here thinking while you were describing that. We've probably been doing these Q&As for 10 years or so. And just a quick look back, it's interesting how the questions from year to year change. And in some years, it seems like most of the questions are sort of spiritual, theological in nature. Other years, there's been interest in sort of like the political, cultural environment that are going on, and so people have questions about what's our position or what's a Christian's position on this or that. And so it was interesting in this last one, there was an abundance of questions about help me navigate this world that I'm living in. And in particular, the one that you're referring to, or the couple that you're referring to, these were parents saying, man, I got my hands full. I've got elementary age school children, or I've got teenagers in junior high, senior high, who are being introduced and exposed to all sorts of things. And parents, I think this really genuine plea for help. Like, I think the parents they're asking from two places of need. Some of the parents are saying, I don't even know how I should respond to some of what I'm hearing and seeing in our world. Help me as a Christian to know how to think about these things. But then they're also coming from a point of need to say, help me help my kids.
Yeah.
And some parents are saying, I think I have a response figured out. I think I have a position or a paradigm that's working for me as I embrace or as I encounter my culture at work and in our friendships and other arenas. But I don't really know how to do that with my children. I don't know what language to use. I don't know where the line between me just sort of enforcing my worldview on my kids or allowing them the liberty to form their own worldview. And it's just such a delicate dance, and it's full of all sorts of landmines. And so it's just interesting that this latest Q&A that we did, there seemed to be a lot of questions around that whole social, cultural dilemma that people are finding themselves living in and wanting to do right as Christians, as Christ followers. And I think the tension there is, and I think this would be an excellent discussion sometime for the podcast, was, what is the balance between speaking the truth and speaking it in love? And I think parents, particularly with younger children, they're wanting to raise their kids to be these loving, kind, compassionate, understanding, empathetic, sympathetic, hearted children or people. They want that for their kids. But they also want them to understand and know truth and right and wrong and morality and, the distinctions between all of those things. And we just happen to be living in a time where anybody who stands up for right versus wrong or truth versus a lie ends up getting labeled all sorts of derogatory, terms, and are castigated as being unloving or judgmental or, whatever the derogatory idea is. And parents don't want that for their kids, because then their kids just end up getting bullied, either by their peers or sometimes even by other adults in their life. And so it's a hard time to be raising kids and knowing how to do this in a way that's, healthy and balanced.
Yeah.
I really feel for parents. My wife and I, we have two sons. Both of our sons are young men now, 26 and 21. And while we're still very engaged and aware of kind of what's going on in their world, they're also at a place now where they're making many of their own decisions and choices, and we don't really have a say in assigning what direction they choose to go. And thankfully, from what we know, they're both making some really healthy, solid choices. So, but boy, if our kids were in middle school right now, it'd be, I think, a whole different ball game. And again, my sons are still fairly young, so it wasn't that long ago that they were in junior high. Mm-hmm. And I think you and I've had a conversation that just since the time that you were in high school, everything's changed a lot.
Yeah.
the sheer volume of what kids are being exposed to, and the intensity or aggressiveness in which it's being, thrown at them, is just creating a dynamic that I'm not even sure I understand and appreciate. And there's parents living this every day.
Well, I'm not a parent yet, obviously. Well, I guess not obviously, but I'm not a parent yet. But like, how do you think I feel? Like, who knows what it's going to be like in 5-6 years?
Careful what number you put there. Your parents are going to be expecting grandkids.
Well, they can expect all they want. They can expect all they want. They just stay alive. That's their problem. But
yeah, I mean,
like,
at the rate it's changing, just in the last 5 to 10 years, imagine the next 5 to 10 years if nothing happens to stem the tide.
Yeah, it's called homeschool. That's the answer to that one right there.
Possibly for
at least one answer.
Some.
But
we always talk about the proverbial slippery slope.
Yeah.
And there's a place where on the slope you get so far over the vertical edge that now you're on the horizontal edge of the slope. And using the analogy, there's a point where the slippery slope, now you're against gravity.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter how much you fight and you claw to stay there on the curve. You can't fight the forces, and it just drags you down.
Yeah.
And I kind of, and I don't want to be alarmist or the prophet of doom here, but as a student of culture and society, I really do look at what I'm seeing happening in our society and in our culture, and I go, we may be getting to that place where there's going to be no recovery. And then the descent is just going to come at, an enormously fast pace. And the decline of much of what we've always known and understood as, morality and truth and freedom, it's going to change right before our very eyes. And, I have people who, push back on that and say, it's not that bad and that'll never happen. And there's just too much history throughout the world to demonstrate that, yes, it can happen. It has happened. And when it did happen and all the pieces were in place, it happened very, very quickly. And it got very, very ugly.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain naivete to say or to think that'll never happen in America. And I'm not going to be that naive.
Well, and those people that are saying that can't happen here are the same ones that were saying that a lot of the ideologies that are causing this kind of confusion was just on college campuses. It's not going to spread out into like broader society and culture. It's just going to stay on college campuses. Once they get a job, it'll go away. That didn't happen. It spilled out. And so, yeah, saying that it just can't happen or like it's not going to get that bad, I think is naive. And preparing for it is better than being unprepared for it.
And that isn't just some sort of cultural conspiracy theory. That's a biblical concept.
Yeah.
I mean, the writers of the New Testament are very clear that there will be a worsening of the times. I mean, just a kind of a short way of describing that. That throughout history, there will be a decline of morality and a decline of truth and a decline of guardrails or boundaries that, once again, the world will sort of know this anything goes sort of existence. And when anything and everything goes, it's not good. Some people like to portray that as, well, that would be utopia if anything and everything goes, but that's not how it works out. So this isn't just sort of, conspiratorial talk. This is, the Bible indicates that there will be a decline throughout history that will be extremely difficult for the faith of Christians to prevail, for the truth of God to have, a mooring on an influence in society. And I think it's the person who's wise, whose eyes and ears are open to that, and can look at the news and can look at culture and look at society and go, well, I mean, I'm starting to see some pretty clear evidence that that's exactly what's happening. And so I'm, as a pastor, I live in this balance or this tension of trying to figure out, how do you talk about those things to prepare a congregation to live out their lives as followers of Jesus Christ in an ever-changing world that's in decline, without using the church or the pulpit, if you would, as some sort of a soapbox about those things. And it's a difficult tension to navigate, because you want to talk about like relevant examples of how I'm seeing certain things happen in relationship to biblical truth, and yet some people, they don't think the church should traffic in any of that. And it's just been an interesting dance in my heart and mind to try to figure out how and when to talk about those things in a way that is truly anchored in the scriptures and not just sort of political rhetoric.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, like, back to your like slippery slope example, is perhaps a good time to do that is whenever you think that the chance of someone starting to slip, someone being the congregation or just people in general, Christians in general, it is pretty high. It's like, when do you say, hey, there's a slope there?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you use the analogy and you kind of look at it in depth, the time to warn somebody about the slippery slope is not when they're on the slope.
No.
It's
too
long
late
before the slope. It's giving them caution about the direction that you're headed will end up on the slope and beyond if nothing stops you from making the choices that you're currently making.
Yeah.
And, this is the book of Proverbs over and over and over again. The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, there's a lot of reference to this young man. And, he's a metaphor, this young man. And then the context of the book is like his father offering him advice to guide him through life. And the father uses this illustration of a young man who's being foolish, who's making poor choices, and he heads off down paths that are very attractive and inviting and seductive and pleasurable, and they're very appealing. And then the father says, but the further he goes down the path and the deeper he gets into the choices that he makes, he ends up finding out that it's not a good path at all. And there's severe consequences to his life. And so the father, in the context of the genre, is saying, son, don't head down that path. Steer clear of that path, that foolish path. And so, yeah, I stand as a pastor in the life of a congregation, and I have enough conversations with people, whether that's counseling appointments or lunches or a host of interactions that I have with our congregation, and I hear very alarming things about the thinking behind how some people are choosing to live. And I see slippery slope. I see them headed in a direction that will be dangerous. Stop me if I've already talked about this in a previous podcast, but and we're already off the topic. But
intro.
So I was thinking about culture and society and what we're seeing and where it heads. And I was thinking in terms of this may not make sense to all of our listeners unless you live here in San Antonio, but if we were standing on I-10 at, like, let's say Wurzbach, and I'm standing in the medium, on the wall between the north and the west and the eastbound lanes. If I was standing there, and if you asked me, can you see Houston from here? I'd say no. And you'd say, can you see El Paso from here? And I'd say no, because Houston's 3 hours away east, and El Paso's 6 weeks away.
Seems like it when
west,
you're driving there.
Right, 6 hours away west. And so I can't see it from I-10 and Wurzbach. There's too many twists and turns and billboards and buildings. There's too much distance between those destinations. So no, I can't see them from there. But here's what I know. If I got in a car and I drove 3 hours east, I would eventually come to Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And if I got in a car and drove west for 6 hours, I would eventually come to El Paso, because that's where the road leads.
Yeah.
And so what I'm seeing morally and culturally happening in our times is, while I can't necessarily see everything from here, I know enough. I know enough from history. I know enough from the guidance of the scriptures. I know enough from just being an observant, intelligent human being, that if a person stays on the road that they're currently on, they will come to the slippery slope and they'll go over the edge.
Yep.
And so what I'm trying to do as a pastor is shepherd a congregation in a clear and compelling enough way to say, hey, the road you're on, or the road we are on, will not get us to where we want to go. And we can be naive and say it'll never happen, but if you stay on the road long enough, you will eventually arrive at the place that God's word tells us are the consequences of these sorts of immoral abdications of truth. And that's what I'm seeing. And going back to our original topic, I think parents have enough of they have experience as 30, 40, 50-year-old adults. And they've traveled enough of their own road to know, if I stay on this path, I would have ended up in these places, or I did end up in these places. And so they're concerned about their kids. I don't want to see my kids go down the same path that I did and end up in the places that I did. So my heart really goes out to parents these days, and the enormous challenge they have of trying to navigate culture and society and what their kids are encountering. So if we can do something here today to offer a little bit of encouragement and help, I think that would be valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, well, I guess we'll just kind of get into the main question that kind of stemmed from all of this was, somebody had asked, do we shield our kids from evil or show them the evil and point them in the right direction? And how do we do this properly? That question, and then some things that you were even saying earlier, is like, biblically, it's not, hang with me here, it's not a sin to drink, right? It's a sin to get drunk. It's not a sin to eat food, but it is a sin to be gluttonous and eat too much and just be consumed by it. And these, like, to go too far, in excess. It's not a sin to have money or have things, but if that's the only thing you're focused on. And in the same way, it's like with parenting, or even with these ideas that can cause problems, a lot of them, they themselves are problematic, but they're even worse if they're taken too far in excess or too far in a single direction down that road. And even with parenting, it's like, do we shield our kids from evil and keep them into this small, walled off place where they don't know what the world is like? That can be almost too harsh of a hand, too excess, when then they're not going to be, I guess, they're not going to be exposed to anything,
They won't be prepared for anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on that Sunday when we got that question, I think one of my responses was, we want to raise wise children. And wise is a great word for healthy. We want to raise wise, responsible, healthy, mature children. That's the objective. As parents, we're stewards of these lives that God has entrusted to our care. And that right there is an enormous understanding, because it really, to be a good steward of the lives that were entrusted to your care, you have to be an engaged, you have to be a very involved and vigilant parent, particularly in these days. Mm-hmm. So we want to raise these wise, healthy, mature, responsible human beings. And what we have to recognize is that takes a lot of work. That doesn't just happen.
Parenting's not easy.
Yeah. And so what I was saying to the congregation that day is, we want to raise these wise children. We don't want to raise naive children. Mm-hmm. But what that demands is that the release of information, or the exposure to information and ideas, it has to be doled out in increments of time that correspond with the child's capacity to be able to understand them and process them. And so there's certain ideas that can be explained to 3 and 4 and a 5-year-old that's healthy for them and is necessary for them. But there's other ideas that shouldn't be introduced to a 3 and a 4 and a 5-year-old. In fact, they shouldn't be introduced till somebody's 16, 17, or 18.
Yeah.
And right now, and it's all over, examples in the news, there's this whole push to take themes that really should be introduced only to children with a capacity to process the information. And we're looking at a late teen and even that may be early when you start to think about brains being completely formed, not until what, age 25 or something like that. But at least there's a sort of a dexterity to be able to handle some themes.
Yeah.
But now there's a whole push to introduce those themes fitting for 16, 17, 18-year-olds to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Mm. And that's very concerning. And so what I'm going to advise as a parent is, you have to introduce your children to all sorts of ideas because they're going to encounter them. But you have to introduce them at a pace that your child's capable of understanding and processing them. And so a wise parent just recognizes, well, this is not the time to be talking about this topic or allowing them exposure to this topic, because they just don't have the mental, emotional bandwidth to handle it.
Yeah.
And so it takes a really intelligent parent to be able to distinguish when, where, and how their child is introduced to topics. And so what that requires is that the parent has to be very vigilant, not only in what am I talking about and how am I talking about it, but what are they encountering on television, or what are they encountering in, other forms of entertainment, whether that's movies that kids are watching or books that they're reading. And it certainly demands that parents be very vigilant about what other adults are saying to their children. There used to be a day, and again, this maybe makes me sound old. I think
it does.
It does. Thank you, Wyatt. I think there was a day where this assumption was adults have a child's best interest at heart, and so an adult wouldn't purposefully mislead or confuse or manipulate a child. I think those days are over. A parent cannot just assume that. They have to be very diligent to vet who it is that's having an influence in their lives of their kids, from teachers to coaches to, you know, clubs that kids are involved in, what friends' houses they're going to. And I don't want to be the parent who, you know, is afraid and alarmed about everything, but there's just too many examples that demonstrate that not every adult is mature enough and healthy enough to distinguish what children should be introduced to at a pace that's good for them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, those things, regardless if the child is ready to understand it, should not be introduced by really anyone but their parents anyways, right? You know?
Well, yes, I would say that generally speaking, the parents ought to be the stewards of that information.
Yeah.
Now, the way that I would kind of knock out the walls on that definition, I would say, or anything, or anybody the parent has approved.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
like a
certainly,
counselor,
yeah.
or a doctor, or a trusted teacher or coach or something. So, if the parents are aware of and knowledgeable of who it is that their kids are being influenced by, then that's certainly a resource
Yeah.
to parents. Because, granted, there's plenty of situations where parents don't know what to say or don't know what to do or
Yeah.
when. And so you have a pediatrician, or you have a psychologist or a therapist or a counselor or a pastor or, you know, a teacher or trusted friend who may have skills and knowledge about that. And so you use them as resources and you allow them to speak into the life of your children. But this whole idea of keeping the parents out of the loop and denying parents access to what children are being exposed to, that's completely inappropriate. And parents ought to feel very vindicated to stand up and oppose that whenever they find themselves being left out of the parenting loop of what it is that their children are being exposed to.
Certainly. Yeah. Well, yeah. And whoever gets the blessing, because a lot of the times too, like, whenever I was in the student ministry here, like the kids aren't going to talk to their parents about certain things. And so even in that way, it's like, okay, we'll go with this person who essentially has my blessing, I know that person. Hopefully you'll talk to them more likely than me, which is understandable for certain topics with kids. But you definitely shouldn't be kept out of the loop. And also, like, this isn't just what we're referring to. These aren't things that we've just read. These are videos that we've seen of teachers themselves saying that they do such things. It's not just us being hyperbolic or ridiculous. But yeah, so they are up against, I mean, like, for instance, back whenever I graduated from high school 5 years ago, things have certainly changed, like you said. And it's even more surprising now how it's like, I mean, I went to high school in Bernie, which is a very, very small, little kind of secluded to itself town outside of San Antonio in Texas, where you'd think would be just about, I guess, the safest place from weird ideological ideas to seep through. Not true. Like they are here too.
Yeah.
And things have changed a lot. And I do think a lot of that comes through social media and technology.
Because we no longer live isolated in the communities that we grow up in.
Yeah.
We live very much in a global world because we have immediate access to what's happening around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so a kid in Bernie, Texas, he has access to anything happening in Hollywood, California, New York City, China, Japan, Russia. I mean, he literally can have influence from anywhere in the world. So it would be, again, naive to think that sort of thing wouldn't penetrate, what we call the bubble here, this isolated, safe, upstanding little community that we live in is what we often refer to as the bubble because it seems to be, somewhat insulated and protected from certain things. But the truth of the matter is inside the bubble, it's all there.
Oh, yeah.
It's all there. And maybe not at the public and prolific nature as it is in other communities outside of, say, kind of conservative Texas, but it's all here.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to be the doomsayer, but I think it'll just continue to increase to become more and more prolific and more public, just by the nature of how these things go.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've seen that, the evolution of certain things through.
So, again, back to the discussion, we don't want to raise naive children, so we have to be very intentional and careful about kind of this calculated release of information over the life of a child. And so there's, those early years when, and maybe this is old school, but I believe in it, is protecting that naive innocence of a child for as long as we can.
Mm-hmm.
So being careful not to allow them to see or to hear some themes is not irresponsible. In fact, it's very responsible. It's protecting their young mind. And then you start looking at ages like 9, 10, and 11. Well, there's a shift there, a maturity shift that's taken from 3, 4, 5 to 8, 9, 10, 11. There's a shift. And so now a release of additional information and ideas is appropriate because they have a little bit bigger bandwidth to handle it. But you're still being careful. Parents, if you haven't introduced the idea of sexuality to your children by that age, well, then you're begging for problems because they're probably already having those conversations. And they're having them with their friends, and those aren't healthy, mature, inputs. Mm-hmm. So you have to start introducing children to those sorts of themes, but to what depth are you diving into that topic?
Yeah.
Well, then you come into 12, 13, 14, 15. Again, their whole world's expanding. They've gone from elementary school now to junior high school, a whole host of inputs into their life that are exposing them to a lot more. So really, the big thing there is, have you created a culture where you can have the conversations?
Yeah.
Where it's safe and it's comfortable to talk about whatever without mom and dad melting down and blowing up and, reacting strongly, that just scares the child from feeling safe to talk about those things. Mom and dads have to be able to hear whatever their kid is curious about and have that conversation, so that by 17, 18, and 19, almost any topic is on the table and is comfortable to be discussed and explored, because now you have a new bandwidth of maturity and capacity for the child to handle it. Plus, now you're in the whole preparation stage. I mean, the whole journey is a preparation, but it gets really, really critical in that, 16, 17, 18 years old period, where I'm getting ready to send them off to college or career. They're going to be out on their own, autonomous, directors of their own fate kind of thing. And if you haven't taught them how to think, if you haven't taught them how to choose, if you haven't taught them how to stand up in the face of peer pressure and go against the flow, then basically you're sending kids out ill-equipped for life.
Yep.
And the role of the parent as a steward of the lives that were invested to them, that's maybe the top of the list of your job, is to prepare your child for the day that they embark on life on their own.
Well, I think that's a really, really good, just straightforward answer to, do we shield our kids from evil or show them it? It's, if you shield them too much, they won't even be able to identify evil when it's in front of them.
They won't even recognize it.
Yeah.
I had this thing I did when the boys were little, and I mean, it's fairly innocent, but it was very intentional on my part. We'd be sitting watching television together, and a commercial would come on. And I'd say to him, boys, what are they selling?
Mm.
And at one age, they would always say, they would just answer the product. Oh, they're selling soda, or they're selling a car, or they're selling a mortgage. And I'd say, no, what are they selling? And they'd always, I don't know, Dad, what? They're selling a car, they're selling a soda. And so then I'd get into a discussion with them, and it was all kind of fun. It was playful. And I'd say, well, look at the people who are in the commercial. And look at how they're dressed, or look at the car they're driving, and look how the advertisers are making that sound like it's so appealing, or it's so successful, or so. And so I would get into these discussions. They're selling you a worldview.
Yep.
And they're selling you a lie. Is that if you drive this car, people will think you're successful, and people will admire you, and people will think you're wealthy. Or if you dress these ways, or if you drink these things, then you're going to have lots of friends who are standing around you having lots of fun. And just kind of opening their world up to the fact that not everything is as it appears, I think in some ways was intentional parenting to prepare them to see their world through, a little bit broader lens.
Yeah.
And I think there can be a lot of creative ways that parents can do that sort of thing, but the point is parents have to do it. They have to be actively engaged and very vigilant at preparing their child to become an adult. I was thinking as I was getting, preparing for our talk today, as a pastor, I get invited into some very personal sides of people's lives, and not here and there. I mean, pretty regularly, I'm talking to parents. And one of the things that I've seen a shift just in the last few years, how many parents have come to talk to me? They have a college student who went off to college, and either their freshman or sophomore year, they came home. And the parents are really worried and kind of brokenhearted and confused by that. And what I'm finding in these conversations with these parents is what brought the kid home was not academics. A lot of times they were making straight A's, so they were getting 4.0s. They were doing fine academically. It was the other dimensions of being away on their own at college that proved to be overwhelming. It was the responsibilities, it was the pressures, it was the social relational dynamics, it was a lot of emotional fragility where they just couldn't handle what it is that they were facing. And what that is a reflection that in many ways their kid wasn't prepared. That there was a part of a parenting strategy for the first 18 years of their kid's life that really didn't sufficiently prepare them for what they were about to encounter. And it's just been interesting that that's a kind of a growing trend of conversations I'm having with parents.
Yeah.
Now, I have this really, old guy explanation for that.
Let's hear it.
And when I've shared it, one of my sons just called me a boomer, just
nice.
Yeah, making fun of me. And again, we can go down this track just a little ways, but I absolutely think there's a relationship between sort of the emotional, relational, psychological fragility that we're finding more prevalent in the lives of young people. I think that there's a relationship to that in video games. That a child who spends so much time kind of in this unreal world of video games, and they are in control, and everything sort of falls out as they determine it, and the amount of time that they spend on those games And you can't miss the connection that for a lot of these kids, video games become a way of coping with what is hard or disappointing or frustrating in real life. So something gets hard, something's disappointing, something's frustrating, they run off, they play their game, they hide in that little world of the video game. And you think about the number of hours and the number of years that a child spends kind of in that coping, escapist world of games. And then he's tossed out, and maybe that's a dramatic term, but he's thrown out of the nest. He goes off to college, and now it's real. Mom and dad aren't picking up after him and doing his wash and making his food and setting his schedule about when he's going to study. And so there's just a host of things that are going to be frustrating and difficult and disappointing. And what I'm surmising is that his or her inability to be able to handle real life in that context of college or the first years of career has to do with the fact that they have not developed the emotional, psychological capacity to handle frustration, disappointment, and difficulty because of their exposure to this unreal world of games. Now, again, that may sound really old fogey-like, but I've done enough reading and research on it. I'm not positioning myself as some kind of scientist or expert on it, but I think I have enough proof to say I'm somewhere in the ballpark of one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of 20-somethings who are emotionally unprepared for the world that they encounter when they're on their own.
I think that here's, I guess, my idea of it. So have you, and I'm going to tie this, I'm not going to get too far away from the topic, but do you know anything about the correlation between if video games increases actual violence, violent video games, does it increase violent in the kids? And I ask because I know what at least the main research has done. So I don't, but
yeah, I haven't done enough research in that particular angle to say yes or no definitively, but it wouldn't be a hard leap for me to make. Is that if a child is really lost in that kind of, fantasy world, and the game offers an option of violence as a way of dealing with whatever obstacle they face in the game. Again, younger minds don't have the capacity or the rationale to distinguish that it may be a higher likelihood that they could resort to violence in the real world as a response to something that's threatening or opposing.
So from the study that I found is that it doesn't increase acts of violence in kids, but it does increase the reaction to seeing blood, gore, or violence. So, like, for instance, the Army will oftentimes even use simulations, which is what a video game is, to try to dull the reaction to such things. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that your reasons for why you think video games do that, because they can't control it and they can just, like, they're safe inside that world and having them go their way. I don't think it's video games so much. I think that that's just one piece of a bigger problem, which is too safe of parenting. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
I have not.
It's by Jonathan Haidt. It's very good. It's insightful. But that and other things that you can just examine, it's like, okay, think of Leave It to Beaver times. Mm-hmm. They could go out, be home by 6. Okay? Whenever you were, I mean, like,
that's what I grew up.
That's what you grew up with. That's kind of how I grew up, but that's just because my dad's my dad. He didn't care. Yeah. Every time I got a cut that needed stitches, he's like, I can do it. If I need to get the stitches out, he's like, I can pull them out. I'm like, I'll pass. But the kids could go out. If they got hurt, they had to take care of themselves. If somebody was being a bully, they took care of themselves for the most part. If they needed help with something, they either helped each other. But then it starts to change to where now they no longer take care of those problems themselves. They no longer find answers themselves. They no longer do any of those things. As soon as something problematic comes up, I mean, something they don't like, there's always somebody of authority they can run to then stop that thing from occurring.
To fix it for them.
Yep. If somebody's being mean, go tell. Somebody's saying something you don't like, go tell. Mm-hmm. All of these things. And so then I think a lot of parents would much rather their kid be playing video games than off possibly getting hurt in a small way.
Yeah.
They'll complain about, how he only plays video games, but they complain even more if there's any risk of him facing any kind of danger or anything at all.
Yeah.
I guess that's where I would push back on that idea, because I do think it is too safe of parenting that's
think about it.
These kids.
Well, think about it. So they're not unrelated.
No, not at all.
If you have a parent who's excessive at protecting their child, and video games is one of the ways that they are assured that their child's safely in the context of their home and nothing can happen to them, well, then this one's feeding the other.
Yep.
And again, I don't think this would be an inaccurate statement. There are plenty of parents who are lazy and apathetic about the hard work of parenting, that they love devices like televisions and video games and social media because it keeps the child occupied. And then they are free to kind of do whatever, the parent's free to do whatever they want to do because they don't have to manage. But the problem with that is they're handing them a device that's dangerous. Yes, it can be educational. I know the pushback. Oh, but there's so many educational programs. Yes, but a child left unattended to television, computer, or social media is basically got an entire world open to them.
Yep.
That they will either stumble into or they'll find another way, and then it can be off to the races. Because, again, so many times children lack the maturity at certain ages to be able to distinguish if this is a safe place or a dangerous place.
And I think, too, like I've definitely seen the parents that just, if their kid is being annoying, throw them an iPad and say, go play. Which normally that's what the kid ends up wanting anyways. So then they aren't annoying anymore. But I think a lot of it even comes from, I think, a better place within a parent. Again, I don't have parents. I have parents. I don't have kids, so maybe I'm being naive, but parents want their kids to be safe. So keeping them from the big bad world is going to be something that's not an unreasonable desire for me to understand. The thing is, it's like, this is like Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's like she was willing to allow her son to die. Granted, there was I would say the biggest reason possible for that, to save the world, but that's just an archetype of what all parents essentially have to do. They have to allow their kids to get hurt, and they have to allow their kids to just go off, right? And I don't think that we're allowing our kids to go. I can see it in my friends. I mean, one, I'm still at home, which is, it's not embarrassing anymore necessarily, but like it used to be embarrassing. It's like, well, you should be out on your own. It's not so much anymore. Things are way more expensive, whatever. There's a whole bunch of reasons and excuses, but like a lot of my friends don't know how to survive by themselves. Granted, they're guys, but like the girls have their own issues. Yeah. And so they're not being allowed to go off, and good parents have to, it's like how every good teacher eventually has to become like, they would hope that their student becomes better than them, right? Every good parent has to like fail so that their kid can become better than how he is now. Peterson talks about like, well, you can make your kid entirely safe if you just made him titanium. He's huge. Anything that's possibly wrong, he's just programmed. All that. But then you don't have a kid anymore. You know?
Yeah.
You disagree?
No, I don't disagree. What I'm thinking is, I just keep coming back to how imperative it is that parents be actively engaged and vigilant to really know what's transpiring in the life of their child.
Yeah.
And who they're encountering as friends and what they're being asked to read and discuss at school and where they are on the internet. Not assuming. Well, my boy's good. He'll make good choices, and you just can't be that careless. I'd rather go poking around and find out that he is in fact making good choices and trustworthy, rather than just assuming that and finding out that your son or your daughter's into places that are dangerous. And that's, again, I it's just funny how often I'm saying something about how this makes me sound old, because there was just a different day and age in which I grew up in. But, we wouldn't give a 3-year-old a machete.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't give a 10-year-old a rattlesnake as a pet, because there's inherent dangers. But we naively hand them a cell phone.
Oh, yeah.
And we buy them, whatever apps and social media accounts that they want to have. Many of them are free. But we give them the resources to go to places that are in fact dangerous. And I'm just thinking it has to be different than that if we expect different results. And I have to tell you, I got a couple of friends who have made decisions, and it's very unpopular decisions, very unpopular with other parents. It's very unpopular with their children. And they're just saying, no phone until, a certain age, much later than all the other kids. Or there's no after midnight activities until a certain age. And everybody else is out till, 2 and 3 in the morning. Or there's, a host of controls that they're putting in place, and they make the kid feel, really put upon, and they got friends who make fun of them for being, so conservative about their parenting. But I'm telling you, my hat's off to some of these parents who are making those kinds of decisions, because I'm just aware of so many other parents who don't have any controls about what they're allowing their kids to do, and yet they find themselves in my office going, my heart's broken because my kid's a mess.
Yep.
And there has to be a correlation. I don't know how you would disagree with the correlation that this untapped influence of all sorts of improper entertainment, it's having an impact.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think you think this necessarily, but I wasn't arguing for no constraints or making sure that you're very, very vigilant. In fact, for sure, my kid will be, whenever he gets a phone, if it's too early, there will be content restrictions all over that thing, and time restrictions all over that thing. I guess what I was saying was, whenever it comes to conflict, more than, I was arguing that we've been too safe whenever it comes to conflict with our kids.
Sure.
And then that's what results in a lot of the
issues.
issues.
If you're always rescuing your kid, they don't develop a kind of mental, emotional toughness that life requires.
That's where the fragility comes from.
Yeah. And, you can, like I've seen it with, 2 different parenting approaches just in the same couple. Like sometimes men have a very different parenting style than a wife.
Mm-hmm.
A husband has a different parenting style than a wife. And so, the kid falls down and skins his knee. And again, I'm not trying to be stereotypical here, but the mom runs over and, oh, you're okay, and holds him and brushes it off and kisses it and, all the stuff. Kid falls down, dad goes, oh, get up, you're fine, rub it off, walk it off. And again, there's all sorts of opinions about who's right and who's wrong in their parenting style.
They're both right.
In those moments.
You know?
Yeah. And so maybe there's a balance, is that the child needs some reassurance and some comfort when they face pain. But to isolate and insulate them from that pain and not teach them that there is the responsibility of getting up and moving on, shaking it off and proceeding forward. That's just as important to that child's development.
A perfect example of that. In fact, it actually happened today. Allie sent me this video because we read books and stuff, so we talk about parenting and how we want to parent, because that's a wise thing to talk about before marriage.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're not on the same page about it.
One of the 5 topics.
Yep. That could destroy the entire thing. Anyways, we're on the same page just about most things. At least we'll figure it out. We might not be once we get there. But she sent me this video of this husband, father, holding space, is what they called it, holding space for this kid who was throwing a tantrum. Okay. Basically just had this kid and just allowed him to throw his tantrum.
Yeah.
Which I think is wise. Not like he just sat there and cried, basically, and yelled. But he didn't get what he wanted. But then I saw the dad. This kid was like thrashing around. This kid was face down, laying down, and he was kicking. And the dad was holding his arm out so that his feet would hit the dad's arm instead of the floor. And I was like, this is a perfect example of like, I would just let the kid kick the floor once, realize it hurts, and then he doesn't do it again. It's like, well, that's not. But now it's like, well, we need to shield them from all of that. Like, he'll be fine. Just let him scream. It's like, and don't let him hurt himself while he's being ridiculous. Okay. But I do think that you see a lot of that, of like, of shielding it from everything and allowing that fragility to fester, because, and it comes from a good place, which is the bad part. It's like, well, I love my kid. I want him to be safe. I don't want him to be unhappy.
Right.
But too much of that, you end up creating somebody who's not ready for the world, and then will suffer because of it, which makes the parents feel horrible about themselves.
Yeah, we're really uncomfortable these days with love being hard. Love always has to be happy and convenient and comfortable and accepting and affirming. And no, sometimes true love is saying hard things and having to do hard things to honestly protect somebody, either from themselves or for something else that's dangerous. And we struggle in our culture nowadays with understanding what love is. And we're getting bombarded with this whole idea that if you love me, I get to do whatever I want. And the truth of the matter is that that's not true. That if I love you, I will warn you off from the dangerous road that you're on and where it leads to.
God loved us so much that he allowed his son to be crucified on a cross. That's pretty hard love, right?
Right.
Like there's something given there, and there's something asked of someone when that love and growth. Like when you think of love, he's like, well, I want my kid to grow up and become an individual. Well, that means he has to grow. And if you have to grow, well, then you have to allow the kid to experience pain and conflict and a certain amount of, I'm going to use the word suffering, but like there has to be sacrifices made, like in the same way in the gym. We've talked about this kind of stuff before, but it's like it hurts whenever you push the amount that you can push or beyond that amount.
Yeah.
And you're going to fail and you're going to get stuck and look like a dummy. But
you're not doing it right if you're looking like a dummy.
Well, whenever you fail, you look like a dummy. Nobody else thinks you look like a dummy, but
you feel like you look like a dummy.
Yeah, because everybody else fails too when they're in there, which is like why people like gym cultures. Like, yeah, we all get it. Kind of sucks, but you get better because of it, right?
Right. So I was going to tell you an interesting story that I think is relevant to this topic. When we had our first son, we lived in Madison, Wisconsin, and we had a friend at our church that I was serving at. She was a pediatrician. She was just this delightful person. She had this really kind of vivacious personality, and she was funny, and she brought that into her profession. She was fun to be around if you were parents with a small child, because she could just make the teachable point of view so entertaining. And she came to San Antonio after we moved here. Her and her husband came here for a conference, I think, or they were looking to move here. Can't remember exactly how it worked out, but we had dinner with them. And at that time, our son was now, I think, two or three. And I asked her, I said, why does our son ask us the same questions over and over and over again? You know, why is this or what is that? I mean, he would just ask. And we would tell him, and 10 minutes later, he'd ask us the exact same question. And she had such a profound answer. She said, he's seeing if you'll answer him the same way every time.
What's true? What's real?
And so what she's doing, what she said he's doing is he's verifying truth.
Yep.
And he's verifying trust. Can he trust you to consistently tell him the truth? And that was so enlightening about so many things. And so when you stop and look at our world today and what's happening, you have an entire push to redefine truth, to where now pronouns don't mean what the rules of the use of pronouns means, or scientific fact is no longer seen as inflexible truth or fact. We can change it.
Depends on the fact.
Right?
Right.
And
which
so
makes it worse.
what we're happening is we're telling children, no, that man can be a woman, or that man can use pronouns like he, like she and her. And what it does is it not only confuses the child, but it demolishes a sense of trust in a society and people to tell them the truth, because everything's different, or they're trying to make everything different or
Equal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, you know, like a child asks, what's that? And you say, it's a cat. What's that? It's a cat. What's that? It's a cat. And you do that enough times, the child's collecting, because he's born with a blank slate of information, and it's all input into what he begins to understand about his world through observation and through listening. And so he asked that question enough times, he's told that's a cat enough times, he begins to understand that four-legged animal with that particular tail, they call that a cat. Well, now he trusts that that's a cat. And then he sees another four-legged animal, and it's got four legs and a tail, and he says, that's a cat. And no, the adult says, no, that's a dog. What's that? And so now he has to work through kind of a new set of information. And through his observation, he begins to put together, oh, the dog, that animal with the four legs but the longer nose and the stiffer tail, they call that a dog. So as long as that stays consistent, then we have a means of communication and dialogue, and we have a means of trust. But when you start changing the categories and the words that go with them, then a child doesn't know what to believe. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't know who to trust. And so that's why I think parents have to be incredibly engaged, and they have to be incredibly bold to resist a lot of what's being shoved down our throats these days through education, through social media, through political influences. A parent has to be incredibly bold to stand in opposition to that thing and refuse to let their child be manipulated by it.
Yep.
Because in the end, we're not just confusing that child, but we're destroying their sense of trust. Trust in the parent, trust in teachers, trust in authority, trust in anybody or anything. Because if we're so free to change the rules, then there are no rules, and nothing can be consistent. And so this is, I think, the really challenging world that parents are living in right now, with this attempt to change the way that language works, this insistence to change the way that science works, the way that structure in society works, and man, that's hard.
Oh yeah.
And so parents, my prayer for them is be bold. Do not be intimidated by the louder voices to end up swallowing the lie as the truth, because you're hurting yourself, you're hurting your kid, you're ultimately hurting our society as a whole if we allow that sort of thinking to become the way that we relate to each other. It just wouldn't be good.
Yeah, a child without any kind of truth, or if he doesn't hit any opposition, so like if he has no guidelines, if you don't get on to, I was listening to this one person, he was talking about how one time he did horribly on his grade report, and he shows it to his mom, and his mom goes, "Oh, it's not so bad." And the guy was like, he's reflecting back, he's like, "Geez, am I like really that worthless that you can't even like do you either don't think I can do better, or you think I'm so fragile that I can't you shouldn't be proud of me for that."
Right.
And it's like a kid without any borders doesn't know what he can and can't do, and if he can do everything because everything is equal, like you said,
yeah,
he's not gonna do anything. He's gonna be confused the entire time.
Right. So, very dicey world. I don't know how we're doing on time here, but
We'll probably wrap it up here before
I
too
don't
long.
want to end without making two recommendations. Parents, if you're listening and interested in some resources, these are just two suggestions I'm making. If you've never seen the documentary called The Social Dilemma, I would highly encourage it. It's incredibly insightful about the power of the manipulation that's happening with social media. I mean, it's an entire, we use the word all the time, algorithm. I mean, it is a very intentional, destructive algorithm that's being used to have an influence in your kids' lives and creating what essentially amounts to an addiction. And so if you want to be a parent who's responsibly involved in allowing your kids access to social media, please watch that documentary. I think it's so educational. And the really funny or interesting thing about it is some of the original creators of social media are the people being interviewed. And it's amazing how many of them would say without hesitation, my child does not have access to social media. And they created it.
Yeah.
But they created it and watched it be, overrun with destructive forces. It ended up becoming something that the original creators never intended. And so now they're standing back saying, oh my gosh, what have we created? And my child doesn't have access to it. So parent, just a recommendation. The Social Dilemma is a really, really great resource. The other one is maybe more for a teenager, young teen. The book Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley, I just think is such a great read to prepare a child to understand a little bit about how life works and where certain choices and certain priorities and certain behaviors will ultimately lead to if somebody stays on the path. So I would highly recommend that book. I put the challenge out to our church family to get their teenagers to read the book. I had a lot of people that took me up on it, and we've heard a lot of great stories back about how that was very, very helpful. I'd even go so far as to say, offer your kid $100, read the book, and then we're going to sit down and discuss it, and then I'll pay you $100. It would be $100 worth investing in the future of your child. So it's a great book, and it comes from a very biblical, perspective of what wisdom is and how it all works and how God designed life to work. So another recommendation I'd make to you. And then the third recommendation, and I'll be done recommending things, is, man, parent, anything that you can do to normalize the discussion of faith in your home, the idea of praying together, reading a Bible together, discussing theological and spiritual topics together, starting at the earliest ages, anything that you can do to normalize that will go so far in creating some really wonderful lines of communication with your kids as they get older. And so whether that's, and here we go. We got callers calling in now.
Heck, yeah. The lines are hot.
Anything that you can do from the early stages, reading Bible stories when you're tucking your kids in bed at night, devotionals as a family, sitting around the dinner table, beginning meals with a word of prayer. And that's not always about praying for the food. That's about praying for each other, praying for things that are going on in each other's lives. Starting in those early days of a child's life, that just makes it easier to normalize it. Again, I'm a preacher, so you might expect me to say this, but mom and dad setting the example, the priority of attending church and being, at church as a family on Sundays goes a long way to establishing that this is a priority and a value in our life. And again, I don't want to be the bad guy here, but modeling for your children that somehow church is an option, and if there isn't anything more exciting or more attractive to us, we'll go to church. But anything from the lake to select baseball to a host of other activities, the family that kind of dives in and out of church based on the priorities of other things is just modeling that it's really not that big of a value and it's not that big of a deal. So in the mind of a child, it just becomes an option.
Yeah,
it's optional. And so I just think anytime you're inviting God and his wisdom into your relationship as a parent with your child and making it really comfortable to have those discussions in relationship to things like racism and sexuality and a host of other topics, you're just gonna have not only great conversations that serve your child well, you'll also, I believe, have the help of God in your partnership as a parent, and it's just gonna better serve you. So I hope some of those suggestions might be helpful to parents who are out there trying to figure out what to do. If you got kids in junior high and senior high, find a great church with a great pastor, great student pastors, and make use of that occasion to keep your child connected to good friends and good resources. And I just think those are really, really important priorities for a family that wants to not only raise children well, but have God's help in the equation to do that.
Yeah. And I guess I'm going to be kind of straightforward here, but I see a lot of recommendation from me too. I see a lot of families coming and the dad is not with them.
No.
And that is not how it should be. I think the fathers should try everything in their power to be at church with their families. But rarely do I ever hear of a man saying, "Yeah, my wife didn't want to come to church this morning." I don't know if I've ever heard that ever once, not even once. Sometimes, but not because they're just out doing something else, really. Most of the time.
Yeah.
I would just say that fathers need to make that a priority for sure. And then you touched on the other one, which was, I think, very instrumental in my life. Again, I'm not a kid. I can't get that right. I'm not a parent. But as a kid, reflecting back, eating dinner around the dinner table almost every night, every week, was very, very instrumental. It made me comfortable speaking to people, formulating my thoughts, telling people about my day, even just small stuff, and then praying around the table and having that led and modeled by the parent. Oftentimes, with homework and how busy everybody is, the meal's the only time they're all together. And most now don't even get that. But if that can become a priority, I think that alone could change so much. And
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
I think there's something very holy about a dinner table.
I was raised in a family. My wife was raised in a family where we had dinner together every night with our parents, and then Charlotte and I, that was inflexible.
Yep.
If as much as we could, if they had a football practice or something, we understood that later in life. But we were almost every night of the week we were having dinner together, and you're right. There's an environment there. There's a little microcosm of healthy living relationally that's captured in that meal together, and it's so important. And then I couldn't affirm more this whole priority of a dad's involvement in this. There's a quote: "Speed of the leader, speed of the team." And when dad is sending off mom and the kids to church while he, sleeps later, works on the car, or goes plays golf, whether he knows it or not, he is teaching a value. He is modeling a priority. And what will happen is that once that child develops enough autonomy to be able to speak his own mind, he's going to say, why should I go to church if dad doesn't?
Yep.
And mom's going to be at a loss of knowing how to answer that because the kid's exactly right. And so, yeah. And I'm really grateful. There's some wonderful dads at Cibolo Creek who, whether they're, divorced and they're single and so they're raising their kids, or they have a wife who's not interested. We have some wonderful examples of dads who come to church with their kids even though mom doesn't. And I've always just had, just an enormous respect for them because I think they're making a really, really wise choice that's going to serve them well for years and years to come in the life of their kid. And, I'm certainly, I was in a counseling appointment here a couple weeks ago, and this guy's wanting to make some changes in his life and, quote unquote, get his life together. That's what he was talking about. And so I was saying, well, if you're really serious about that, a suggestion I'd make to you is make attending church on a Sunday morning a priority.
Yep.
And I said, it's not about you checking a box and, fulfilling some sort of obligation that you went to church. It's about you getting around the people and the place where God does stuff. Mm-hmm. And so if you're wanting to increase the exposure that God has in your life, then put yourself in those places. And I actually ended up describing it as, if you want to warm up to God, get around the campfire where he can be found. And one of those places is church. He has established the gathering together of believers for worship as a place where he is and a place where he works. And so if you're wanting to increase your exposure to God at work in your life, church is a great option, not as some obligation that you have to fulfill, but as a community of people that provide you a context of your new quest to make God a larger priority in your life. And so the same with families, with children. I'm not talking about dragging kids to church by their hair, as some sort of, compulsory obligation. I'm talking about really inviting your children to engage in the life and the worship of a church, their friends, the studies, the activities that nurture spiritual growth in the life of the kids, so that they really do end up appreciating and valuing the input that a church family has in their life, rather than, well, I had to go to this thing and sit and listen to some guy. Don't be dragging your kids to the adult service and expecting them to be really, really engaged. Get your kid involved in the children's ministry or the student ministry, where there's peers and topics and presentations that are much more in the style that your kids are going to, gravitate toward. Whatever you do, don't make church a chore. because nobody likes chores.
Yeah.
The minute that they can stop doing that chore, they will. So work really hard at making your family's experience at church is a really delightful thing, and it'll pay huge dividends for years and years to come.
Yep. All good stuff. And any of those, I know you mentioned a book or two, and The Social Dilemma. I can put that stuff in the episode notes at the bottom. That's the first time I've said that.
Wow, the episode notes.
The show notes, the episode notes. Wow.
Sounds so official. It's like we're trying to create a podcast or something.
It is. I feel like one of the other 2 million of these that exist. Probably more. But anyways, hope that this was helpful. And heck, there's so much that we could say about tips and things for parents, and that might justify completely another episode, which I'm sure we'll touch on whenever it comes to families and things.
There's no shortage of topics that we've identified to talk about.
No, none at all.
So we'll just keep forging ahead, and I hope that over time we develop a bit of a recipe for how best to serve our audience, and that in time we get a sense of knowing that we're flipping the switches and talking about the kinds of things that are helpful to people, because that, in the end of the day, is what this was all created for.
Exactly right.
Well, thank you, Wyatt. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Absolutely. See you guys next time. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget that new episodes are released every Wednesday. If you'd like to listen to our Sunday morning messages, you can find those by searching Cibolo Creek Messages. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about Cibolo Creek Community Church, you can find us at cibolocreek.com. Thanks for listening.